Were medieval people genuinely as violent as history suggests? What do the shadows of history say? Want to discover the underlying causes of this enigmatic period of darkness? Join us as we go further into the video and shatter your preconceptions through the intriguing question that's perplexed scholars and archaeologists for centuries. Buckle up, as this fascinating voyage will take you to the heart of a time when violence reigned supreme, and the reality will amaze you more than you can imagine. Violence was a big part of the Middle Ages, from wild fights to rapes and mass murders. The violence came in many forms, such as wars, brutal tournaments, and dangerous fights over power and land. But how do we prove that? There are many violent signs of social inequality on the bones of people who died in the Middle Ages. Archaeologists who dug up graves in Cambridge, a historic city in the UK, found that working people were much more likely to have broken bones, which could be a sign of work-related injuries or violence. On the other hand, the rich elites were buried in relatively good shape. Some of the bones tell strange stories from the Middle Ages, like how a monk was killed by a big cart. They also show how grim life was for many people during this time. The Violence Research Centre at Cambridge University in the UK just showed off a project that used data visualization to map killings in medieval London. The map shows that between 1300 and 1340 CE, 142 people were killed in a city of about 80,000 people. The information on the map comes from coroner's rolls, which are formally records of investigations into how someone died. In an interview with The Guardian, the project's director acknowledged that he was relying on the work of prominent historian Professor Barbara Hannawalt, but arrived at his own conclusions, namely that the European Middle Ages appear to have been a particularly violent time. The director came to the conclusion that the Middle Ages was so dangerous that if anyone had guns, they would have quickly wiped each other out. But that's not really a good way to describe the time. The Middle Ages weren't as violent as we often think, and the centre's director's finding here has more to do with what we think about the time than with what it really was like to live there. In fact, saying that medieval people would have quickly wiped each other out tells us something important about the lies we tell ourselves about the world we live in now. Based on what most people know about the Middle Ages, it might seem like a reasonable conclusion to say that it was a very violent time. We often think of the Middle Ages in Europe as a very dangerous time and place. It happens so often now that it's almost like a cultural norm. Fantasy games like The Witcher, TV shows like Game of Thrones, movies like Braveheart, and books like the Broken Empire series all contribute to the idea that violence is everywhere. They do this by setting their stories in the Middle Ages with heroes and castles, and experts are just as likely as anyone else to make broad statements about violence over time. In 1921, the famous historian John Huizinga wrote, "Life was so violent and mixed up that it smelled like blood and roses." Steven Pinker, a psychologist, found that crime has been going down since the time before modernization. The medieval murder map seems to support some of these ideas. We know, of course, that how data is understood is the most important thing about it. Sometimes, the same set of facts can both prove and disprove what we thought about a problem. In the case of this murder map, we should think about what 142 confirmed murders in a city of about 80,000 people over a 40-year stretch really means. The US Department of Justice says that in Roanoke, VA, a place about the same size as London in 1300 CE, there were more murders in a shorter amount of time. In his book Violence in Medieval Europe, Professor Warren Brown looked at a lot of historical data about violence in England and then compared it to similar data from US and Europe. He came to the conclusion that, as strange as it may seem, 13th century England as a whole was not much more violent than the US or Europe at the turn of the 21st century. While most of the US or Europe had much less violence than most of the 13th century England, some city dwellers have about the same level of violence, and sometimes even more than the rest of the country. So, does this go against what we expected, or do we choose another city of the same size that proves a higher murder rate in the Middle Ages? Take the previous quote from Huizinga, for example. "Life was so violent and mixed up that it smelled like both roses and blood." It gives a very clear picture, but does this show the whole picture? We focus on the word blood in that line, but what about the roses? The rest of that line tells you why. Huizinga writes at the end of Blood and Roses that medieval people always run into extremes between the fear of hell and the most naive joy, between cruelty and tenderness, between harsh asceticism and an insane attachment to the pleasures of this world, between hatred and goodness. He's talking about people who can't be easily put into one group. In other words, we can't forget that we're talking about real people with real lives. People in the Middle Ages in Europe saw and did bad things, but they also saw and did things that made them happy and amazed. The exact ratio of one to the other probably depends on a specific person, in a specific place, and a specific time. As reported in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, archaeologists from the University of Cambridge dug up 3 different sites in the city: a local church graveyard for ordinary working people, a charitable hospital where the sick were cared for and then buried, and an Augustine friary where clergy was buried next to wealthy donors. X-rays of 314 skeletons showed that 44% of the people who worked had broken bones, compared to 32% of those who lived in a friary and 27% of those who were buried near a hospital. These people spent their days doing hard physical labor for long hours. People in towns did things like stonework and blacksmithing, or they worked as general laborers. Outside of town, many people worked hard in the fields and took care of the animals from dusk to dawn. In the different graves, 40% of the male bones were broken and 26% of the female bones were broken. Even though most of these injuries seem to have happened to people who worked, the skeletons show that the Middle Ages were a hard time for everyone. About 4% of the population had violence-related injuries that were probably caused by others. One story that was found in the graves was about how a monk who lived at a well-known Augustine friary died in a horrible way. Even though they had a pretty good life compared to most people, their skeleton was found with both of their upper leg femur bones crushed. Whatever broke both bones in this way must have been very bad, and it's possible that it was a cause of death. Our best guess is a cart crash. Maybe a horse got scared and the wagon hit him. It looks like a lot of the monks' lives or deaths were very brutal. 6 of the 19 skeletons of the Augustine friary that were thought to be monks showed signs of having been hurt. One elder woman who was buried in a cemetery for working people was found to have broken her ribs, mouth and foot, as well as several vertebrae in her spine. In an unusual way, most of these injuries had healed before the woman died. This led to the experts thinking that the woman had been abused by her husband for most of her life. It would be very rare for all of these injuries, for example, to be caused by a fall. Today, most broken jaws in women are caused by violence from someone they live with. This injustice is written on the bones of people who lived in Cambridge in the Middle Ages. However, people from all walks of life experienced severe trauma. Life was hardest at the bottom, but hard everywhere. Thank you for joining us in a time of legends, knights and epic fights. We went on a quest to find out the untold truths about violence in the Middle Ages. In this exciting investigation, we challenged the long-held idea that warriors are bloodthirsty and dove right into a maze of historical accounts. We were wrong about what we thought we knew about this mysterious time because of what we found out. But our journey doesn't end here. We want to know what you think. In the comments, tell us what you think and what you know. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to get updates on our new episodes, where we'll keep digging deeper into the interesting stories that shape our world. Join us on our next adventure as we continue to find out amazing facts about the past. Until then, keep watching.